should have a map. Yes?
Yes, good.
Thank you. Okay, so this is before the Romans, as we call them, think of them as Romans, there were the Etruscans. And there, in many cases, one of the things that happens in history that kind of fits with what we were just talking about is that a lot of times if you don't go looking for something, you don't find it. And so for a long time, nobody even knew who the Etruscans were or what they did. But archaeology, so that's one of the things that happened to me is, I have to go traipsing and hopefully you bear with me, those of you who are more academic than I am, but I have to go traipsing all over the world in time, or I choose to, and try to tell kind of the big picture. So the Etruscans, the truth is we know less about them than we did about the Caphtorites that I was talking about last week, the Minoans that Arthur Evans dug up Knossos and named them Minoans. About 600 BC, Cerveteri had a population of about 25,000, and it dominated 3 harbors. And these harbors, they built in the Etruscan society, they built they built 2 cities side by side. So if people hadn't been really interested, like the Egyptians, in somehow having a life after death or somehow caring about how we took care of those who died, we wouldn't know anything about them either. But once, one was for the living in the Etruscan society, and the other one was for the dead. So they had, twin cities, and when you died, you just went to the other city. And they had beautiful art, and that led some scholars to believe that women were held in high regard. And the reason is because they're usually depicted as couples. This is an Etruscan piece of Etruscan art, and in a tender embrace or a confidential pose. You can kind of see that here. And also, this was the interesting thing, the inscriptions listed only the wife's name, which usually when we look at history, if an inscription lists only the husband's name, we tend to think of it as a patriarchy. Now, we have no idea, really, whether there's a patriarchy, a matriarchy, some sort of egalitarian society, because we still don't know that much about them. But we do know that they created magnificent jewelry. And some of this was found in the grave goods and the things that they managed to dig up. And it would appear that they lived a luxurious life in high-walled cities. They disliked those crude Romans, who apparently learned a lot of their technical knowledge from them. And I find this kind of interesting because I want to ask you to think about whether it's possible that most great civilizations are done in by the envious, crude, warrior kind of folks who are beating their chest on the outside of it. Because I think there's a pretty good case that could be made for that. Okay. So that's enough. That's what I know about the Etruscans. And I'm sure there's probably more been discovered since I was starting to work on these lectures years ago. But now we're going to move on to Rome and the Roman Republic. Rome is divided into 2 major sections, the Roman Republic and the Empire. And you can see here that the Republic, which went from 509 to 31 BCE, it was defined by war. Rome was defined by war. And in the beginning, those wars were defensive wars. They were under siege, from those who were more advanced or not. And they created their own mythology about that Roma, the mother of Rome, or the twins, Romulus and Remus, from whom we get the term Rome, was part of their mythic past. And it's very mythic, as it said, that they were basically saved by a she-wolf who nurtured them, that they were orphaned, little babies, and this she-wolf nurtured them, and therefore they grew up to found Rome. Okay. Now, part of the mythic past is about the rape of the Sabine women. First of Rome's heroines were the Sabine women because they made peace, the Roman women who made peace between the Sabines and the Romans. Okay, so here you have women as peacemaker in the very, very early period of Rome. I want to go on. I may come back to this one, okay? I will come back to this. This is one of my favorite pieces of art. It's by Bologna. It's, obviously Renaissance art, but this is a depiction of the rape of the Sabine women. Okay, so here and so the Sabines were living in the same area as Romans were, and they basically the Romans were a bunch of guys, kind of a gang, right? A gang of Romans, and they had no women, but the local Sabines had women. And so they went and they captured them, right? And hauled them back. So it tells you something about what we're going to see about Roman women, right from the get-go. It was founded upon rape. And, but nevertheless, they hauled them back, and I don't know if they treated them well or the women just got used to being with them, or maybe the Sabines weren't much better as husbands than the Romans were. Anyway, when there was going to be war, the women made peace between the two of them. So goes the story. It also turns out that women were the sole owners of land under the Etruscans and under the Sabines. So the kings, like Romulus, traced their ancestry through their mothers, which, again, at this time wasn't too unusual in the Mediterranean. We still had that in Crete and in Greece, right? But they also had the, as we learned last week, the Achaeans, who were also a race of warriors, and so some people say they were descended from those folks. These defensive wars were to protect their fertile watered plain between the 7 hills of Rome. And this founded the Republic. The Republic was an oligarchy. It was the main body of the Republic was the Senate. And the ideal Roman was someone like Cincinnatus during the Republic. He was at least the ideal. He was a citizen soldier who, when the war was won and they could, come back home, would beat his sword into a plowshare when he returned. And there were lots of wars, so he had to do this several times. So back and forth, Cincinnatus would go to war, pick up his phone. One of the things I wanted you to think about, does this sound at all familiar as an American? And the story of our expansion and the difference between republic and empire and how it affected them? Well, just kind of think about that as we're going along, because I think we Americans can identify fairly well with the Romans. The Romans were actually a very secular people. Okay, gods and goddesses, largely borrowed from the Greeks, and the people they conquered, and they made the highest virtue loyalty to the state. Okay, so the most Roman thing you could do was to be loyal to Rome, and as a result of that, and they had people in the past and such that they admired. And one of these were the Stoics, okay, the Greek Stoics. So they believed, and part of, Stoicism, which is what we get from the Stoics, is the idea that, you just bear with it, right? You're a good citizen, you hang in here. People are calling on Stoics these days a lot, right? Come and be a Stoic for our tough times. And it's one of our values, I think, that we have. Also, they also took booty and ideas from everybody they conquered. So they were not real rigid, right, in their ideologies. They were kind of flexible in ideology. They were also great engineers. Okay. And they were great engineers for both war and pleasure. So they were great at building, roads so they could conquer people and keep them conquered. They were great at adding to or learning from and then adding to the technology of all the people that they conquered. And they also were pretty good at building beautiful villas and, excellent living for those who were at the top of the game. Eventually, war, though, becomes almost constant. And when that happens, the generals become the rulers. But it took them several hundred years to do this rather than overnight. Okay. Now, I want to stop and ask us a little quick question. I'm going to escape for a minute here. And I want to ask you to unmute yourselves for just a second.
You want to get out of screen share?
Oh, I do.
Okay.
I knew there was some reason. Thank you. Did you do that for me?
I did.
Oh, thank you. See, I can't get by this course without Barry. Thank you. So unmute yourself for just a second, if you would. Can you just unmute all of us for a minute, Barry?
I can unmute people who didn't mute themselves, but if you mute yourself, I can't undo that. It's interesting.
Okay, well, those of you who'd like to participate, would you unmute yourselves, please? Because what I want to ask you to think about and ask is what made and broke Rome. We'll get into more of that, but you've probably heard quite a bit about it. Maybe you watched, series on it. And how do you think they are like us Americans, or not like us so far? Anybody? Way in there? You're all muted. Can you unmute?
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Susan.
Okay.
Anything to compare us to Rome, or not?
I just got back into the meeting, sorry. So I would say what's going on in today's world? Or
Is
no?
similar.
Similar.
So
similar.
yeah. And we're in a position right now where we've been on top of the world like the Romans were for quite a long time. And we aren't anymore, and we're not very happy about that. Irene, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I can see a parallel in the decline and fall. I think we're now in the fall.
We are. I think we're on the cusp, and yes, that's a possibility. But we will look at that, of course, specifically about Rome. Anybody else want to weigh in?
I think we're relatively young to be falling. I mean, we're only talking a little more than 200 years, which doesn't seem like much in terms of major civilizations.
Good point. Anybody
and
else?
What about the lead poisoning?
What's that?
I said, and what about the lead poisoning from their goblets?
Our COVID.
Yeah, maybe.
And
Or maybe our cocktail. The cocktail that they give us will do us in.
Well,
Barry, go ahead.
One way I think we're similar to the Romans is if the Romans were and we are kind of like an engineering obsessed society, So this has been the way both of these societies have succeeded in a way, building roads and building things. And on the other hand, it, allows us to expand a lot. And then that puts us in confrontation with a lot of other people and societies around the world. But I think we kind of share that a bit with the ancient Romans.
I would agree very much. Yeah. Anybody else?
What about education?
I think that we're right from the beginning, maybe not so much now, only in our heads, we're expansionistic. We see things and we take them and we make them our own. And so when those little pieces want to be their own, we don't like that. And
That's right.
I think, we don't, it's too much. It's too much.
We're also very good at adapting the things they have, the places where we've expanded, to our own way. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Last chance. I'm going to go back to.
I mentioned education. Educating the public would be the best way to have a better society. Unfortunately, when people are uneducated, then they just become followers. Whatever somebody says, they just follow, rather than studying for themselves, figuring out for themselves.
Right. That's true.
They
They
also had slaves.
What?
They had slaves.
Slaves.
They built on slaves, just like
And so did we. Yes. Yes. And with regard to Lillian, your comment, which I think is certainly understandable, well, gee, a couple hundred years here. One of the things I think we are experiencing and have in our whole, basically our history, American history, is that time is going much faster. That is, time is not going faster, but everything happens faster. So, like the Germans that I studied early on, Hitler had these dreams of having a 1,000-year Reich like the Romans, well, it was 12. And, maybe we're doing better than them, but, it's certainly, we can't count on things, going through generations and generations. Things are moving faster.
There is something about empires, the Roman empires, the Greeks, the Persians, being Persian and knowing the Persian Empire history. I know the Cyrus the Great has freed the slaves, and that was the biggest thing that he did in his time. And it's well known that there weren't slavery back then. There was slavery, but every country that he conquered, he set the slaves free. So why did the empire fall, even with giving the freedom to people? So that's something to talk about. That's
an excellent question. Let's put that one here. Does giving freedom to people necessarily indicate a better society or a longer living empire? And one of the things that happened after the fall of Rome was years and years and years of chaos. And so part of the argument for empire, or for one big serious leader group, is the stability that it provides. And it is true. And if they are fairly open to including others, you might say the immigration issue, right, of Rome, they didn't have to immigrate to Rome, although many did, but they could become Roman citizens by acting in Rome's interest. And that's how Rome, I think, was successful in its long-term expansion. Okay, any other comments? Well, I'm going to go back. So we haven't really looked at how they lived and how they fell. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go back to the screen share. Oops. Oh, technical difficulty here.
You can just close that.
Can I close that?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Oh, no, now where is my stuff? I think it's back here. I was hiding behind, of course.
Yeah.
Here we go. Okay. So, are you guys in the middle? You're in the middle of my share.
Yeah.
Can I?
Try hitting the escape button again. It may be this full screen thing that's.
Well, I can move you over here.
We're seeing your
bother me.
Gmail. Your Gmail.
Huh?
You're
seeing Gmail?
Yeah. Yep.
Oh dear. Okay, let me try this again.
You got it.
You're back.
Now are you seeing a map?
No, we're not. Did you hit the share button on the bottom right?
Okay, I'm going to escape again here. And I'm at normal view here. I hit shoot. I'm going to hit this again. Screen share. Share.
It looks good. Yep.
Yeah. Now what are you seeing?
Yep. We're seeing your PowerPoint, so you just need to hit your full screen.
Gotcha. That's what I was trying to. How's
Good.
that?
Good.
Okay. I can still see you, and that's actually fine with me. But anyway, so here we are. We're looking at a map, okay? And what I think contributed here to the downfall, but also to the great expansion and success. So first we have the success, and of course later we have the downfall, were the Punic Wars with Carthage. What happened is that as Rome became, as you can see here, basically a player in the Mediterranean, they got into a lot of wars, of course, because they're looking for booty, and they got a big taste for others' luxuries. And those luxuries weren't in Rome. Rome was fairly Spartan as it started out. It wasn't Spartan literally, I mean, but you know, where we got the term Spartan, where you suffer with having only basic things in order to serve the state. And that was a Spartan ideal. Anyway, the Romans, as they began to travel and see what was out there in the world, got a real taste for other people's luxuries. They also tended to have a bit of vengeance in them. That is, once you get into a war, then they become the enemy, and then you hate them. And so their vengeance often went on for 2 or 3 generations, and they had three wars with Carthage, which was right here, as you can see on the map, and it was, pardon me, a much more advanced civilization in terms of its luxuries. It was more like Greece. It was more like Crete, right, and the other places there in the Mediterranean. And it had big cities that were, of course, great for plundering. The problem was that the change in land ownership due to a loss of the citizen soldiers would become a permanent lifestyle. To maintain this, they had to keep fighting and expanding and expanding and fighting. Barry, you'll appreciate this because we've been talking about, can capitalism go on forever, you know, in your group. And people, at least the common soldiers and even the generals, would end up spending their lives out here in the bush, right, trying to keep the people under control. So the Roman legions began to be a kind of a permanent lifestyle. And the generals of those legions, of course, had booty to hand out, and they were living on other people's booty, right? They were living on those places that were conquered. That becomes kind of a way that you have to keep going. Okay, slaves did the work at home. So at home, back here in Rome, okay, where the Senate was, right, where the leaders were, life was pretty comfy. And that's because slaves did all the work of the yeoman farmers. Before, the yeoman farmers, who were not the senators, right, not the upper class, were doing the work. And then now they had slaves. They could buy slaves. They could bring them home from conquest, etc. And therefore, the senators became very rich. And they had big latifundia, you know, big, beautiful homes. And they had big lands. And another thing that happened was that, you know how it is with war, not all the soldiers come home, right? A lot of them who don't settle in the war places die in the war places. And if they were citizens and had a little bit of land or something, that's now being worked by slaves and eventually kind of being absorbed into the estates of those who are ruling and are at home. So generally, then the generals, in order to pay their troops, had to loot wherever they were going. And so the military becomes more and more professional. And of course, it becomes political, because who has the money to pay the workers to pay the soldiers? Well, It isn't being paid out of the rich latifundia of Rome, let me tell you. It's being paid by looting wherever you go and paying your soldiers that way. So the successes in battle change the structure at home. That is that you have more and more landless poor, and they're pouring into the cities. But guess what? They're entitled landless poor. They feel they're Romans, right? They have big Roman egos, and therefore they expect that somehow or other they should benefit by being Roman. And guess what they do? Ever seen a Black Lives Matter march? So most of the people are peacefully demonstrating, and some are looting their own area. So you got to stop them from doing that. And the way that they stopped them was the famous bread and circuses of ancient Rome. So you keep them busy, right? You give them food, and I will go back to that after we talk about women in this regard. Okay. Okay. So now we want to talk about patriarchy, because Rome was a thoroughgoing patriarchy. Okay, it was basically ruled by the rich and basically their army. Okay.
We got the full screen, Gail.
Sorry, I lost it here. There, is that it? Thank you. Keep me on track here, Barry. You're so good. Thank you. Okay. First thing. Women, the Roman matron had a considerable amount of a good life, especially if she was the Roman matron in part of the wealthy, but she never had equality with men. She was definitely a second-class citizen. On the other hand, unlike the Greeks, oh, wait a minute, I didn't mean to do that. Yeah. Unlike the Greeks, she was never secluded, okay? You didn't have that Oriental seclusion going on. So she didn't have to stay in an oikos in the back of the house or anything like that. She was able to participate pretty much fully in the social and cultural life of Rome.
Is this the invention of the bikini?
She was able to be physically active, especially, yes, you know, more likely you're going to find as they move along, the athletes and the people who are showing off are slaves. But it is also true that the Roman matron, it's kind of like Chinese foot binding, you know, the Roman matron in the upper class lost a lot of her rights to be physically free in the world. But prior to that, and under the Sabines and all of those other groups, the women were free to have a life, right? To go to their baths, to enjoy the very expanding, comfortable life that was going on. But the center of Roman society, like the Greek oikos, was the paterfamilias. And there's no accident that it was called the paterfamilias, not the materfamilias, because it was father's family, and that was where you lived, you had your being, and they had, the pater here, could be a very loving father, or certainly to those that he cared about, but he had life and death power over everyone in the family except grown sons. And if he died, the guardianship of that family would pass from the father to the husband. If the woman was married, she was already under guardianship. So the guardian is either going to be your father or your husband, either way, okay? It wasn't without women's use of whatever personal and sexual power they had, but it was not legal, right? And if you're not legal, this is the significance of Supreme Courts and legalities, etc. You come and offend your father or your husband, then you can be disciplined in very rigorous ways. So you don't really have any recourse. Now, one recourse a woman could have was her doting father. If he loved his daughter and she got married, he could keep power over her dowry. And therefore, she could do some manipulation between the men, her father and her husband, in order to have some say. And by the time of Augustus, and this would be the switch to empire, right? That period of time when we're switching from republic to empire. By the time of Augustus, many upper class women were able to choose their own guardians. So if that was the case, it within an upper class woman's life could be pretty comfy. And she could have some say within her family, and even if her husband was, say, domineering or she didn't like what he did, she could pick a guardian who would be more to her liking. Now, family power was a place where clever woman's manipulations might do well. Sons could be played on. They might love their mother more than their father. The evidence of women playing politics exists all through the Republic and the Empire, although of course it is usually condemned as evil. But so that's how we know about what women could do, is those who came down to us through the literature as evil. They were also, of course, pawns in men's ambition and could be killed by their father or brother for sexual behavior with the wrong man. And many were. Not many, but some notorious ones were. Notorious in ways other than Ruth Bader Ginsburg's notoriety. Demographics favor men, at least as far as we know. They outlived women 2 to 1. So there are more men than women in spite of wars. You'd think that they would die in the wars, and also the longevity, as far as we know, of men was about 46 and only 34 for women. Like in Sparta, women got status from the birth of sons, but there is also evidence that they avoided childbirth when they could, and they often could. Now let's talk about class, because class is a huge situation in Rome. There were 2 basic classes, the Patricians. These were the upper class we find in the Senate. They were a small oligarchy of wealthy citizens, and they selected 2 consuls to be the executive. So that control of the Senate has been kind of an important thing in history for a very long time. And then there were the plebeians. Now the plebeians were everyone else. Eventually, they got enough power to organize their own political body, and they gained one of 2 consuls. So the plebeians, who were, of course, kind of like the average American citizen as opposed to the middle class here, they were everybody from the middle class to the lowest class, everybody but the rich. And women were in all classes, obviously, but their power depended entirely on their family, which is not new. By the time of the empire, there were very few very rich patricians and some plebeians and a huge landless poor who felt themselves as entitled citizens. So the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer, and then you have a shrinking middle class. Does this sound familiar? How do you control that vast, entitled, angry poor? And the answer that Rome gave was bread and circuses. The bread was the dole, and it went disproportionately to males. And whether they shared it with the females that they were connected with, we don't really know. There were females who could be entitled to the dole, but the vast majority of them were males. Now the circuses. The circuses were bloody mayhem, and of course they're famous. The famous Roman Colosseum in Rome was copied all over the Roman Empire, right? So the one we know of in Rome that is still standing was the one, right? Like Washington, D.C., but everywhere else had their blood sport. And I think that this shows how bloody mayhem can control the degraded in a warrior society. And if you'll bear with me, I want to tell you a personal story that made me understand the bread and circuses. When I was in Portugal some many years ago with my husband traveling, we were invited by some local people we'd met to go to a bull fight. And I had never actually been to a bullfight, nor had my husband, but we thought, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? Go do whatever people do. So I said, sure, let's go. And we went. And this was a little local bullfight. And turns out that the bullfighters were primarily young men who were learning how to fight bulls. And so they, first they bring in, of course, all the pomp and the ceremony, and then they set the bull loose, who came, in our case, kind of staggering in, looking a little bit confused. And then they chased him around and stabbed him with these horrendous, picadors. And every time they stabbed him, he would bend down and bellow. And pretty soon, of course, he has blood running down his shoulder, and he's still kind of staggering around, and they bring in this young matador. Well, at the time, I had a 12-year-old son, and this matador looked just like him, kind of skinny and young and little and etc. Anyway, thus proceeds this horrible bullfight. Every time the bull would charge the boy, and he'd mostly get out of the way, once he got tossed once, but, I would see my son there, and I would be on the edge of my chair going, and then, of course, they'd beat the bull, and they would, ultimately he had to be killed, and then they would say, oh, but, we're going to eat the meat, etc. But anyway, the poor bull was just being harried, etc. And every time the bull would come, well, eventually the bull just kind of staggered to his feet, off his feet, and was halfway down to be stabbed. And I went out of that place. Now I need to back up. Before we went in, my husband and I had one of our common little small-scale marital squabbles. And that's because we had a difference. When I went traveling, I wanted to see everything and do everything, and I didn't, double take the hindmost, and he wanted to save money. He always wanted to save money. So we had argued about where we were going to go for lunch. So after the bull fight, we went out, and I had where shall we go for lunch? He said, I don't care. Anywhere, I'm not eating anyway, just pick it. So he won, and what struck me was how drained I was after watching this bullfight. And I think that, I may be wrong, but I think that's the power of the blood sport, is that you get involved and it is so hideous and so emotionally ringing that ultimately when you go out afterwards, you're not really ready to forge a revolution with anybody. So I don't know if that's right, but that's my take. Also, of course, we had slaves. So the well-off were well taken care of. And they had, interestingly, people asked me in the last couple, where did all those slaves come from? And the answer is, of course, mostly they came from war, right? They were captives, and or they could be bought. But interestingly, in Rome, the slavery was far different from our slavery. It was highly diverse. There were high-class imperial slaves, often, of course, maybe brought home the kings and princesses and, high-class folks from the wars. And in many, many cases, they were far better off than free, poorer citizens. They weren't beaten, and the 2/5 of the population were slaves. And there are a lot of big revolts. So some people being slaves is really horrible. But in some cases, to be an imperial slave was better than being, a poor bread and circuses Roman peon. In fact, one of the things that was characteristic then, or was legal at the time, was that slaves were not able to, women were not able to have sex with slaves. But of course, men were completely able to have sex with slaves. So the women of Rome, still a little bit haughty themselves, registered as prostitutes. because a prostitute could choose her lover, maybe even a slave. And high-class slaves often married these Roman women, which made their children free because citizenship went through the mother. So it's interesting that until the men of the upper classes, the rulers, right, got ticked off about that and changed the laws. But for quite a period in there, I don't know, 50, 75 years, women of the upper classes would choose to marry their slaves sometimes because they're more attractive to them, I guess, or to at least sleep with them. And so then the men who had the power of law changed the law to make any Roman citizen woman who did that was turned into a slave herself. That pretty much stopped that little gambit of freedom that the women went for. Women, of course, were found in all classes, and they held many working class jobs, from wool workers to pipe and brick manufacturers, even doctors and entrepreneurs. Politics. There is some success of Rome in how they treated the defeated. And that is, they did provide them. Getting conquered by Rome, if you were an ordinary folk, out there in the provinces, might not be any worse than what you'd had before. Because they provided peace, the Roman legions stayed on, they were a good police force. They provided money, which a lot of the world was still barter then, and they provided a written language to unify. So if you were an intelligent but not very well provided for citizen of one of the provinces, you could learn the language, one language, and you could eventually possibly get citizenship because it became a prize to gain. If you did something good for Rome, and remember, as we spread right out into the whole place, the whole Mediterranean basin there, you could sometimes, through military service, was one of the best ways. If you're a guy and you serve in the legions and you don't get killed, you often can become a Roman citizen. So there again, I think they're somewhat like us. You didn't have to necessarily live right in Rome to be a Roman citizen. So we have Roman citizens and legionnaires all over the entire empire. The allies, the upper class people, let's say, who bent the knee to Rome and could often retain their autonomy. They would become, well, okay, you can now govern for us out there as long as you're doing it the way we want. As long as you pay tribute to Rome and you submit to Roman foreign policy and provide soldiers, you can keep your kingship, right, your local power. What polluted the Roman Republic was money, okay? Wars brought wealth, but the wealth was not evenly distributed, not even close. And they also had a republic. Oops, didn't mean to do that. What happened here? Oops. Sorry, just a sec here. I wanted to speak about Cincinnatus, but okay. So remember Cincinnatus, who built his sword into a plowshare and then became a good citizen and a part of the leadership. There is a history of this, and many of the Romans know it, especially many of the literate Roman upper classes. And so during the Republic, there was an attempt at reform by a couple of upper class young men, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. And it was, in a way, the beginning of the moral fall, if you will, because the way they handled it was they murdered them. Okay. Politicians at home were more and more dependent upon connections with powerful generals. In other words, they are descending into more and more might makes right. The best known, but not the first of these, of course, was Julius Caesar. So where do the women fit in? Well, mostly they're peripheral. They still believed in the loyalty of the Sabines to family and wealth, but direct opposition, well, they did fight, to some extent, but unfortunately what they did, they forced a repeal of one of the Oppian laws. And that repeal had to do with the right to dress as they pleased. Don't mess with our fashion. You know, you can run the show, you can be the heroes, you can go out there and fight with the best of them, but don't you mess with our fashion. Now this, we're going to go talking about the Roman women finally here. I hope you don't mind my setting the stage. Cornelia, this is Cornelia. Okay, Cornelia is one of the ancient, by that I mean ancient in Rome, right, Roman society, early empire, not empire, but early republic, was a paragon of virtue. So this is your ideal Roman woman. She was the daughter of a famous general. She bore her husband 12 children. 3 of them lived, and 2 became the reforming Gracchi brothers. So that's where they came from. They came from this paragon of virtue. She was what is called in Rome a univira. A univira is a woman who married only once in her lifetime. And then she had money and freedom and no guardian. So to be a univira was to be the ideal Roman matron, and she was kind of the picture of it. What am I doing? Another strong and powerful Roman woman was Aurea Paetus. She carried the univira even further because her husband, Paetus, was a senator, and he was a fairly high mucky-muck, but he got in trouble with the main powers that be, and in classic Roman fashion, he was ordered to kill himself. So that, it was similar to the Japanese, seppuku. If you were a high-ranking Roman man and you were considered to have broken the law, whatever there was, you had the right and the duty to kill yourself. But he flinched at that. He had some difficulty killing himself. And so Aurea Paetus, who was, if you kill yourself, then you've gone honorably, then your children will inherit. But if you don't and they have to kill you, then the whole family goes down. So Aurea Paetus, either because she loved her husband so much or she couldn't see any fortune, or she was concerned for her children, whatever the reasons were, she took the sword that he was shaking out of his hand and she stabbed herself. And then she said to him, "It does not hurt, Paetus," and gave him the courage to kill himself. Then we have one you've probably heard of, Livia. This is at we are into the beginning of the empire period. She was the wife of Augustus. And according to Tacitus, who we must remember is a great critic of empire, she plotted the murder of her rivals and all the male heirs between her son Tiberius and the throne. So she had a son, not Augustus's son, but from a former husband. And she wanted to be sure that he got the throne. So says Tacitus. Now, I don't know how much of this is scandal, right? And Tacitus's political prejudices, but she is infamous, and she was not a woman to be taken lightly. So she was powerful, maybe not too good, but powerful. And that's another question to think about is it better to be good or better to be powerful? Which brings us to Agrippina. Agrippina was convinced that her husband had been murdered by Tiberius. Okay, that same Tiberius that Livia helped to put on the throne. And she was furious about that. And so she made a march, her own private march. She brought his ashes to Rome in a big procession and shamed him in public. He exiled her, and she starved herself to death unrepentant. And then we have Hortensia. Hortensia was an orator in 43 BC, and she spoke before the Roman Forum to defend the rights of wealthy women not to pay taxes, because, she argued, they had no voice in in government and had committed no fault to justify fining them. And she won. So she is a source of one of Americans' great explanations for our rebellion, and that is taxation without representation is tyranny. And they agreed with her in ancient Rome. Then there were people, women, who fought the Roman Empire. And one of the most famous of those is Boadicea, or Boadicea. She was a Celtic queen, and in 61 CE, she routed the Roman legions. It took killing 70,000 Brits and sacking London and Colchester and St. Albans to defeat her. She was, of course, defeated and killed because Rome was still on the rise. And then there is Zenobia. Zenobia organized the Arab alliance against the Romans, and she was ultimately defeated and returned to Rome in chains at a great cost to Rome, though. So she took a little bit of them with her. Probably the most famous of the Roman women that we know about is Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra was actually a Ptolemy. Remember when we talked about Alexander the Great and the fact that he divided up that great empire among his 3 generals? Well, one of them was Ptolemy. And so Ptolemy was actually a Greek. And so Cleopatra was actually a Greek. But of course, by that time, Ptolemy and his family had ruled Egypt for a very long time. So she was a queen, and she was sharing the throne with her brother. In Egypt, she did this by marrying him. He was her younger brother, and she wanted to rule. Does it sound like Hatshepsut at all? We understand some of these people who had power, maybe they didn't know their history, but they certainly knew how to deal with power. She used sex, wit, and ruthlessness to conquer the 2 most powerful Romans of her day, of course, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. How did she do it? Well, when it was obvious that she couldn't defeat Caesar militarily, she had herself rolled up and delivered to him in a beautiful rug. She had the advantage of speaking several languages. Among them, that means she could speak to him. He couldn't have spoken to her, but she could speak to him. She unnerved the Romans by going to battle with her troops. How can you go against a woman? This just messes up our cultural beliefs. Weak women, and what's she doing out there? One of the reasons that helped her to be the source of what she did accomplish was matrilineal. Still in Egypt, that is, the person who married the queen became the king, right? Or became the pharaoh. And so there's politics going in here too, right? If you can marry the queen, then you can inherit the throne. So in other words, the matrilineal line for a male husband like Caesar or Antony would have given them a lot of respect with the conquered Egyptians. There's another reason, again, we're back like Carthage, is the wealth and the beauty and the gold and the art of Egypt really wowed the Romans. But of course, sex games are dangerous, and the politics is dangerous in Rome. So when Julius Caesar, the conquering hero, one of their great Roman generals, got tired of being exiled out in the provinces. By the way, he'd already left his, quote, wife, Cleopatra, back home with 2 children, right, and gone off, and he was out in Gaul. He came back, and he was murdered, as we all know. Now, polygamy in Egypt was also useful to wooing Antony, who was married at home to Octavian. Oh, but what's a little wife? We wives, consorts, we have them all, and I have Egypt, don't you think? So maybe she was gorgeous. Maybe she was homely as all get out, but she was competent and brilliant and well-educated and sexy. So that was a good thing to be if you're going to be facing those Romans. Her children by Julius Caesar, however, were a threat to Octavian's rule, and he's the one that's back in Rome, right, ruling. when Antony, his general again, is out dilly-dallying with Cleopatra. And so he had to go to war. And he defeated Antony and Cleopatra in a big naval battle, the Battle of Actium. And by the way, he wasn't all that hard to seduce. He was willing to marry her and gain Egypt, or take her back in shame in a triumphal march. So either way, it was kind of a hard sell on his part, and she decided, no, I would rather commit suicide with an asp. And thus is the famous story of Cleopatra. Now, power in a warrior society, women had very, very little of it. It was, all the laws were made by men, and there is a flagrant sexual double standard. So it's determined by class, though, and of course, women belong to all the classes. They were patricians, they were plebeians, they were resident aliens, they were slaves. And of course, those in the upper classes had more say and more potential power than those in the lower classes. Dress showed who you were and how you should be treated. So the Oppian Law literally dressed, and you remember that's part of the reason that one of the things that the Roman women objected to was having the men dictate their dress. Marriage laws gave men inordinate power. A woman who was married with a thing called manus gave husband the power of the father of life over death. So if she was married with, but why would you marry with? Well, it was also a high class thing to marry with manus, or you might be ordered to it by your father. Divorce existed, but it was varied, of course. We're talking about 1,000 years here, so you had about everything when you consider all the different classes. But it is extremely rigid in the Republic, and it was simply mutual consent in the empire. So the laws about divorce would become more and more lenient. But children belonged to the father, and the economy of dowry would limit what a woman could claim as a reason for divorce, because she usually lost her dowry if she could claim it, unless the dowry had been retained by her father and he was willing to go along with her. So you still had to know how to manipulate men if you're going to have any say at all in this society. There's also a sexual double standard in adultery. Here it says, if you should take your wife in adultery, you may with impunity put her to death without a trial. But if you should commit adultery or indecency, she must not presume to lay a finger on you, nor should the law allow it. Obviously, ancient Rome was a lust-fueled, sexually free paradise for some, and I would add, men. When Augustus came into power, he tried to reinstall republican virtues. He thought the society under the empire was disintegrating, and it was to some extent. So he made adultery a crime of morality, and he lectured the men to set a good example. Well, you can imagine how well that went over. Rape was treated as a crime of one man against another, and if you wanted to prosecute anybody, the man had to do it, and the victim's guilt was assumed. Under Constantine, that's the first Christian emperor, by the way, if a virgin was willing, she was burned to death. You can see that, might was making right a whole lot here. You know what? It's about 11 o'clock. I think we should take a stretch break, a very short stretch break, and then we'll come back and finish this up, okay? 5 minutes, everybody. And Barry, if you want to unmute people, or if you want to unmute yourself and chat, you're welcome to do so, okay? I'm going to try to stretch because sitting in this exact position has me stiff. See you soon. Here we are. Okay. What number? Yeah, 125. Okay, so I want to move on just a little bit. I'm going to go to religion. Wait a minute. It was working before. Religion wasn't really big in Rome. In other words, it wasn't the dominant thread of the culture by any means. Of course, they had religions and they had people who wanted to deal with the spiritual side of life and or at least have something on their side other than might. And there were many choices of religion in a polytheistic society. So here's the virtue and my question for you to think about. And that is, which is better for most human beings, living in a society that is monotheistic or polytheistic? Okay, think about that one. Okay, in a polytheistic society, you have all kinds of religions. You don't have one great big dominant one. And one of the religions, and also like the religions of Greece and of other places, there were both women and men who were involved in them. Women could be priestesses, or they could be joining in one of the many special cults like the Univira. There was a special religion that only Univira could belong to, and Areopagus and Cornelia were among those. And then we have the cult of the Vestal Virgins. And this was the most powerful of the religious belief systems in Rome. It was guarded, they guarded Rome by tending to the eternal fire. Okay, so the Vestal Virgins, it was believed by the Romans that if the eternal fire went out, that Rome, would be at risk. And the way they did that was there were 7 Vestal Virgins, and they were 6 at the time. They were taken in to the cadre of Vestal Virgins and taught how to be a virgin, and they retired after 30 years with a great deal of status and a considerable amount of wealth. So if as a Vestal Virgin you could make it to 36, you could then become a regular Roman citizen. You were still much revered, and you could marry, and you could get on with your life. On the other hand, they could be buried alive if found wanting. So it was kind of a high stakes endeavor. Politics, as well as their own behavior, determined their fate. So here again, you could be sacrificed in burning alive if the state was doing badly, and maybe you were a perfectly good virgin, right? But the state was doing badly and they needed a scapegoat, right? They needed somebody to blame. This happened not too unfrequently. So being buried alive was a real significant risk to becoming a virgin, a Vestal Virgin. The virtue of women was connected to the welfare of the state, just like in Greece. So woman's virtue was what determined how well off we'd all be. So instead of men's violence and their ability to be violent and to succeed at being violent, they blamed it on us. If we weren't virtuous, then of course something terrible would befall the state and it was our fault. Another major goddess was Ceres. Ceres, the Roman Demeter, Ceres was the Greek goddess. She's the goddess of grain. And if you remember, I pointed out that in the Greek mythology, Demeter is among the most powerful goddesses, because when Hades decided to steal her daughter away, she was able to then set the world afallow, right? In other words, she didn't tend to agriculture and everybody starved. So therefore, it was important to be protective. And Ceres, the cult of Ceres, was one of the most protective cults of women. It was exclusively women, you had to be a woman, and they punished men who sold their wives with consecration to the goddess. And consecration to the goddess, by that, in those days, meant you were sacrificed, right? Remember the sacrificial king, the sacrificial lamb. If you're consecrated to Ceres, you die. So there was a little power in that religious group. It was a fertility religion, just like the ones that we've seen in the ancient Near East and in Greece. And it was also had shades of the sacred marriage and the dying king. That's why this, the cult of Ceres was both powerful and could be deadly. And so you better behave when you're around Ceres. Of course, the most popular, especially in the empire, religion was the religion of Isis and Osiris. Now, Isis and Osiris also still has the story of the dying king in it. So it's part of that ongoing kind of thinking and mythology from way back in the ancient Near East. It was a mystery cult. And so it believed in mystics, mysticism, life, death, and there was more than just the physical dying of the body. There was the mysterious dying, life, death, rebirth of the Great Mother, right? So this is, again, humans' attempt, I believe, to how do we cope with the fact that we're conscious that we're mortal and we don't like to die? And at the same time, is there something bigger than us that we should be looking at than just our own immediate potential death? Of course, this is a society that is full of death and dying and people being sentenced to die and having to be warriors, etc. So it's an important religion. And what Isis and Osiris offer is the belief in immortality. Because what happened was that Osiris is killed. And they are brother and sister and husband and wife, in classic Egyptian tradition. And he is killed and dismembered, right, by the evil god Seth. And then she is grieved and desperate, but she's also, remember, the source of rebirth and immortality. And so she goes out and she finds all of the pieces of Osiris and puts them back together. She found everything but the phallus. That somehow never got found again. But anyway, she puts them back together. She puts him back together, and thus they live on immortal. And so, as I said, it's a mystery cult. How can they live on immortal with no phallus and etc.? But you have, if you're going to believe in any mysticism, you have to be willing to go somewhat beyond the very practical, also Roman bodily beliefs. So it's one of the issues that I think that, and again, I see us having in common, but you might not, is that this issue of what is worth dying for, or what does it pay? Are you willing to die? And if you have an immortal possibility, it might be worth dying for. It's the sexual cult, the death of the phallus brings new life, as is often mentioned by poets and others looking at that. And so, and it requires, as do all religions, a certain setting aside of just the pragmatic earthiness of the body. Now, the men-only cult is Mithraism, and it is a warrior cult. And you can see here the leftovers. This is of the bull, right? Okay, the warrior cult glorifies sacrifice, right? It has to, otherwise you're not going to get any warriors. You have to say, my God, there's something more important than life and power. There is, well, in our case, in America, liberty in the pursuit of happiness. There is the possibility of having power over, but you're never going to have power over death, right? Ultimately, we are kind of aware that even if you make it through the warrior time and you get very rich and you become a senator someday, or a president, or who knows what, someday you're going to die. And so the cults and the religions try to deal with that most human of fears, the fact that we're mortal and we know it. And so here you have again, but maybe at least for a while you can get a substitute, right? And that's where the bull, the goddess, ironically, that's a lot of people say, why is the bull a symbol of the goddess? It's because it goes back to that life, death, life pattern that was the goddess and goes through the human sacrifice period and into the more modern period where you can demand, people who are powerful at least can demand a sacrifice. So maybe you could at least put it off. Christianity was first ignored. The Christians in the beginning were ignored and then persecuted and finally made official of the official religion of Rome in 312 CE with the conversion of Constantine, one of the later Roman emperors. And monotheistic Christians turned from the persecuted to the persecutors. And that will be one of the themes I'm going to look at in our next talk. What about that? And remember I said, think about it. What's better for you? To be in a polytheistic society where all different religions are accepted, or into a monotheistic society? And it's an issue that I think we here in America have had to wrestle with and continue to wrestle with to today. It's a major cultural and, issue, and partially we have dealt with it by the separation of church and state. But in the beginning, the Christians, following the Hebrews, were monotheistic, and they insisted that there was only one God. That meant, and then that put them, you might say, at odds with the whole ancient world, most of which is polytheistic, and it also put them in both the self-righteous and the dangerous position of condemning everybody else, right? You're all wrong, and we're right, and we'll stake our lives on it, which we did. So they were seen as a weird, radical, group in Rome, and therefore good cannon fodder, or in this case, the case of the slaves, and taking everybody to be, to the Colosseum if you can't behave yourself, if you cause us too much trouble. And then we have Hypatia, who is a leader of the Neoplatonic school. She's a philosopher, so we still have philosophers. Hypatia was considered, many scholars, the Neoplatonists particularly, of course, considered her the greatest philosopher of her time. But, of course, she was a woman, and in being the greatest philosopher of her time, she overstepped her bounds as a woman by not bowing down to Christianity. And so on one fatal day in the holy season of Lent, Hypatia was torn from her chariot, stripped naked, dragged to the church, and inhumanely butchered. A troop of savage and merciless fanatics butchered her. Her flesh was scraped from her bones with sharp oyster shells, and her quivering limbs were delivered into the flames. That's according to Gibbon in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So I'm going to conclude here and give us time to discuss it if you're interested. But most all remnants of goddess power were eliminated by the end of the Roman Empire and the advent of monotheism, which focused entirely on a male god who drives her so far underground that people even today have a hard time believing she ever truly existed. And that's it for today. Can we go back? I'm going to escape. and go back to stop my share. There you are. And I'd like to hear what you have to say. What do you
I'd like
think?
to hear more about Hypatia. I haven't heard of her before. What was her philosophy?
She was a Neoplatonist. That means, you know, the philosophy of Plato as filtered through the time since Plato. So if you read the Republic, you know, and things like that of Plato, she would have been a modern, in her day, right, a modern Platonist, Platonic philosopher.
Well, when you say she was the greatest philosopher, do you mean of her day or of all time?
Of her day.
Of her day, right.
Yeah.
I thought this was something new that she'd invented, you know, sort of when you said that.
Not really. Well, as is true of almost all people who take, you know, their ideas from someone significantly in the past. We're talking about 700 years here, you know, between Plato and her. They then say, well, what do you think of this? Or like I'm doing in history, you know, as we look at women's history, I'm saying, well, what do you think of this? And how does this compare to, you know, what we believe today? And the truth is, I have not read much about her philosophy. I just knew her as someone who so outraged the monotheists and the, you know, people who were sure that they had the right, you know, that old right makes might, that they would well, torture her to death and make a spectacle of it, which is not unusual. So I am anti-violence, basically. And so you would have found it very hard. And, you know, one of the things about Plato is that he admired Socrates and he used that Socratic method. And that's, I'm sure, what she was doing. Well, you know, the Socratic method can be very annoying if you have another opinion, because whatever you say, the Socratic method then takes it apart, right? Tries to pull it apart and see, well, what about this? And have you considered this other part of it? And that, when you have people who are trying to be true believers, is incredibly aggravating.